The ocean breeze carried laughter across manicured lawns, drifting through tall windows where chandeliers burned brighter than the stars outside. Inside, polished marble floors reflected a world that seemed flawless, every gesture rehearsed, every smile carefully placed. Nothing appeared out of order, and yet something felt absent. In the summer of 1901, in Newport, Rhode Island, a mansion rose that would come to define an era of excess and illusion. The Elms stood not merely as a home, but as a declaration of wealth, of status, of belonging among America's most powerful elites. Its halls echoed with music, conversation, and the soft footsteps of those who served silently behind the scenes. But beneath the grandeur, there lingered an unspoken truth. Lives were shaped not by desire, but by expectation. Relationships were guided not by affection, but by appearances. In a world where everything could be bought, something essential was quietly slipping away. Because within these walls, perfection was not freedom, it was a quiet, gilded prison. Welcome to Old Money Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world of the richest families in history. Here, behind grand estates and glittering fortunes, we uncover the truths few dared to speak. If you enjoy exploring the hidden lives of powerful dynasties, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon to never miss a story. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world of old money. Cornelius Vanderbilt was not born into wealth, nor into comfort. He entered the world in 1794 on Staten Island, New York, in a modest Dutch-American household where survival depended on discipline, labor, and an unspoken understanding that nothing would ever be given freely. His father worked as a ferryman, navigating the waters between Staten Island and Manhattan, earning just enough to sustain the family. From an early age, Cornelius watched closely, learning that control over movement, over routes, over time, over people meant control over income. By the age of 16, Cornelius had already begun carving his own path. With a small loan from his mother, he purchased a simple periauger, a shallow draft boat, and started ferrying passengers and goods across New York Harbor. The work was harsh, often relentless, but it suited him. He quickly gained a reputation, not for charm, but for efficiency and fearlessness. He undercut competitors, worked longer hours, and pushed himself harder than those around him. Where others saw limits, he saw opportunity provided he was willing to ignore the cost. The early 19th century was a time of rapid change in America, particularly in trade and transportation. Cornelius recognized that whoever controlled these systems could shape entire markets. As steamboats began replacing traditional sail-powered vessels in the 1820s, he adapted quickly, moving into the new technology with calculated precision. While others hesitated, unsure of the risks, Cornelius embraced them, understanding that hesitation was often more dangerous than failure. Yet even in these early years, something deeper was taking root. Success, for Cornelius, was not simply about wealth, it was about dominance. Competition was not a challenge to overcome, it was something to eliminate entirely. This mindset drove him forward, but it also created distance between him and those around him. Relationships became secondary, even expendable, in the pursuit of control. What began as a young man's determination to escape hardship slowly transformed into something far more powerful and far more isolating. The foundation of one of America's greatest fortunes was being laid, but so too was the quiet cost that would echo through generations. Cornelius Vanderbilt's rise was not built on chance, but on a series of deliberate, often ruthless decisions that reshaped the transportation industry. In America, by the 1820s and 1830s, as steamboats began transforming travel and trade, Vanderbilt moved decisively into the business, recognizing that speed and reliability would define the future. He did not merely participate in the market, he disrupted. His strategy was simple, but aggressive. Vanderbilt consistently undercut his competitors, offering lower fares while maintaining faster and more dependable service. Where others sought steady profit, he aimed for total control. On several occasions, he reduced prices to such an extent that rivals were forced into financial collapse. Once competition was eliminated, he would raise rates again, securing both dominance and profit. It was a method that earned him both admiration and resentment, but it worked with undeniable effectiveness. By the 1840s, Vanderbilt had become one of the most powerful figures in the steamboat industry. His operations expanded across key routes, including those connected to the California Gold Rush in 1849, where he capitalized on the surge of travelers seeking fortune. His Nicaragua transit route, though risky, proved highly profitable and demonstrated his willingness to gamble when the potential reward justified it. Yet, Vanderbilt's ambitions did not stop at waterways. By the 1850s and 1860s, he turned his attention to railroads, recognizing that land-based transport would soon surpass maritime routes in both scale and importance. Many considered this transition dangerous, even reckless. Railroads required vast capital, complex management, and carried significant uncertainty. But Vanderbilt approached the industry with the same calculated intensity he had applied to steamboats. Through strategic acquisitions and consolidation, he gradually gained control over key rail lines, most notably the New York Central Railroad. His approach remained consistent: eliminate inefficiency, absorb competitors, and create a unified, dominant system. By the time of the American Civil War and its aftermath, Vanderbilt had secured a near monopoly over critical transportation routes in the northeastern United States. It was during this period that his philosophy became unmistakably clear. Power, to Vanderbilt, was not something to be negotiated. It was something to be taken and held without apology. He was once attributed with the remark, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" Whether spoken in those exact words or not, the sentiment reflected his approach. Rules were obstacles to be managed, not boundaries to be respected. By the time of his death in 18, Cornelius Vanderbilt had amassed a fortune estimated at over $100 million, making him one of the richest individuals in American history. But beneath the extraordinary success lay the early signs of a deeper cost. His relentless pursuit of dominance left little room for emotional connection or familial unity. Wealth had been secured, influence established, but the foundation was built on control, not cohesion. Asterisk, when Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he left behind more than a fortune. He left behind a system of power that was both immense and fragile. Of his many children, the majority of his wealth passed to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, a decision that would shape not only the future of the family, but the very nature of its legacy. The message was clear: power must remain concentrated, controlled, and protected from dilution. William Henry Vanderbilt, often underestimated in his early years, proved to be a capable and disciplined successor. Within less than a decade, he nearly doubled the family fortune, expanding it from approximately $100 million to over $200 million. By the time of his death in 1885, he achieved this not through reckless ambition, but through refinement, strengthening the railroad empire his father had built, improving efficiency, and maintaining dominance over key transportation networks. Where Cornelius had been aggressive and confrontational, William was methodical and controlled. Yet beneath this calm exterior, the same principle endured: power must not be shared. With this immense wealth came a new challenge. Unlike Cornelius, who had focused solely on accumulation, William and the next generation faced the question of acceptance. The Vanderbilt name carried power, but not prestige. In the rigid social hierarchy of late 19th century America, particularly among the established elite of New York and Newport, wealth alone was not enough. The Vanderbilts were considered new money, outsiders attempting to enter a world governed by tradition, lineage, and unspoken rules. It was during this period that the family began its transformation from industrial force to social dynasty. The Gilded Age, spanning roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s, became the stage upon which this transformation unfolded. Lavish displays of wealth were no longer simply expressions of success. They were tools of persuasion, declarations of belonging, and, at times, acts of defiance. Mansions rose along Fifth Avenue in New York and across the coastal landscape of Newport, Rhode Island. Each residence was more than a home. It was a statement. Among these grand estates were some of the most iconic structures of the era. Marble House, completed in 1892 for William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva, was inspired by the palaces of European aristocracy, constructed almost entirely of marble to signal permanence and grandeur. The Breakers, completed in 1895 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, stood as a symbol of unmatched opulence, with its vast halls and intricate detailing designed to rival the great estates of Europe. These were not merely residencies, they were instruments of social negotiation. By 1901, the Elms would join this landscape of power. Commissioned by Edward Julius Derwent, a coal magnate closely associated with the same elite circles as the Vanderbilts, the mansion reflected the culmination of Gilded Age ideals. Modeled after an 18th-century French chateau, it embodied refinement, control, and a deliberate imitation of old-world aristocracy. Though not a Vanderbilt by blood, Derwent's presence within this circle illustrated how wealth could grant and provided it. Adhered to the same codes of display and discipline, established by families like the Vandrbilts. Inside these estates, life was orchestrated with precision. Servants moved through hidden corridors, ensuring that the illusion of effortless luxury remained intact. Every detail, from the arrangement of furniture to the timing of meals, was carefully controlled. Social events were planned, not merely for enjoyment, but for impact. Who attended, who was invited, and who was excluded, all carried meaning. Acceptance into this world required more than wealth. It demanded performance. Yet even as the Vanderbilts secured their place among America's elite, the cost of this ascent began to emerge. Marriages were often influenced by status rather than affection. Alliances formed to strengthen social position rather than personal connection. Individuals within the family were expected to uphold the image of perfection, leaving little room for vulnerability or deviation. The pressure to maintain appearances created a quiet distance not only between the family and the outside world, but within the family itself. What had begun as a pursuit of financial dominance had evolved into a pursuit of social legitimacy, and while the Vanderbilts succeeded in gaining recognition, the foundation of their world remained rooted in control, expectation, and performance. Beneath the grandeur of marble halls and glittering chandeliers, something less visible but no less significant was taking shape. The empire had expanded, its influence undeniable, but in the process, the line between identity and image had begun to blur, and once crossed, it would prove difficult if not impossible to return. By the early 1880s, the Vanderbilts had secured immense wealth, but wealth alone could not, by what they desired most, recognition. In the rigid social world of New York and Newport, acceptance was governed not by fortune, but by lineage. At the center of this world stood the Astor family, widely regarded as the gatekeepers of American high society. To be acknowledged by them was to exist. To be ignored was to remain an outsider, no matter how vast one's fortune. The tension between the two families was not born of a single moment, but of a growing imbalance. The Vanderbilts had money that rivaled, and in many cases exceeded, that of the Astors. Yet they lacked the generational prestige that defined old money. This imbalance created an unspoken conflict, one rooted not in open hostility, but in quiet exclusion. Invitations were withheld, appearances were managed, the Vanderbilts were present, but never fully accepted. The initial fracture became more visible through the figure of Carolyn Astor, often referred to as the unquestioned authority of elite society during this period. She maintained a carefully curated list, known as the 400, representing those deemed worthy of inclusion within the highest social circles. For the Vanderbilts, this list was more than a formality, it was a barrier. Despite their wealth and growing influence, their absence from such recognition signaled a deeper rejection. For the Vanderbilts, particularly figures like Alva Vanderbilt, This exclusion was not merely social, it was personal. It represented a denial of legitimacy, a refusal to acknowledge the empire they had built. The conflict, though outwardly polite, carried an emotional weight that would soon reshape the dynamics of American high society. It was not simply about attending the right events or owning the grandest homes. It was about identity, belonging, and the right to stand among those who claimed superiority through heritage alone. Beneath the surface, resentment began to take hold. The Vanderbilts were no longer content with wealth without recognition, and the Astors, whether intentionally or not, had set the stage for a rivalry that would transform social competition into something far more deliberate and far more consequential. Asterisk. What began as quiet exclusion soon evolved into calculated defiance. The Vanderbilts, particularly Alva Vanderbilt, refused to accept a position on the margins of society. If recognition would not be granted, it would be forced through spectacle, influence, and undeniable presence. By the early 1880s, the rivalry between the Vanderbilts and the Astors had shifted from silent tension to a deliberate contest for dominance within elite social circles. Alva Vanderbilt understood that acceptance in this world was not achieved through argument, but through demonstration. In 1883, she organized what would become one of the most extravagant social events of the Gilded Age, lavish masquerade ball held at the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue. The scale of the event was unprecedented. Invitations were extended to hundreds of guests, each expected to arrive in elaborate costume, reflecting themes of royalty, mythology, and European nobility. The cost was staggering, but the intention was clear. This was not merely a celebration, it was a statement. Crucially, an invitation was extended to Caroline Astor and her daughter. The gesture placed them in a difficult position. To attend would be to acknowledge the Vanderbilts' legitimacy. To refuse would risk appearing irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming display. The pressure was subtle, yet undeniable. Ultimately, the Astors attended, marking a turning point in the social hierarchy. In that moment, the Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders, they had forced their way into acceptance. However, this victory came with consequences that extended beyond public perception. The need to maintain such a level of grandeur created an ongoing pressure within the Vanderbilt family. Social events became performances, each one expected to surpass the last. The pursuit of status was no longer occasional, it became continuous, demanding constant attention, resources, and emotional restraint. Within private life, the effects were less visible but deeply felt. Marriages, already influenced by considerations of status and alliance, began to reflect the strain of maintaining public perfection. Personal desires were often subordinated to social expectations, and individual identity became intertwined with the family's image. The success of the masquerade ball secured the Vanderbilts' place among the elite, but it also reinforced a system in which appearances held greater value than authenticity. For the Astors, the shift was equally significant. While they retained their position within high society, their role as unchallenged gatekeepers had been weakened. The balance of power had changed, and with it, the nature of the rivalry. What had once been a matter of exclusion had become a competition of endurance who could sustain influence, maintain prestige, and control perception over time. Beneath the elegance of these social exchanges, a deeper transformation was underway. Acceptance had been achieved, but at a cost that was not immediately visible. The line between genuine belonging and constructed identity had grown increasingly thin, and in crossing it, both families had entered a world where status required constant defense in where personal truth was often the first sacrificed. Asterisk. By the late 19th century, the battle for social dominance had shifted beyond New York's drawing rooms to the coastal estates of Newport, Rhode Island. What had once been a quiet summer retreat transformed into a stage upon which America's wealthiest families displayed their power with deliberate precision. Here, acceptance was no longer debated, it was performed, measured, and constantly reinforced. For the Vanderbilts, Newport became both a triumph and a test. The grand mansions that lined Bellevue Avenue were not simply residencies. They were declarations of identity. Each estate competed for attention through scale, design, and the breakers, Marble House, and eventually the Elms, stood as symbols of refined dominance, blending European architectural influence with American ambition. Their facades communicated permanence and control, while their interiors revealed a world meticulously arranged to impress and intimidate. Within this environment, social acceptance had technically been achieved. The Vanderbilts were no longer excluded. They were central figures in this elite circle. Invitations flowed freely, their presence expected at every significant gathering. Yet acceptance did not bring ease. Instead, it introduced a new and unrelenting pressure: the need to maintain position. In a society where status could shift as quickly as perception, every detail mattered. Events held within these mansions were orchestrated with extraordinary care. Dinners, balls, and garden parties followed strict codes of etiquette. Guest lists were curated to reflect influence, alliances, and subtle hierarchies. A misplaced invitation or an overlooked figure could signal weakness. Even moments of leisure were structured, ensuring that nothing appeared accidental. The illusion of effortless luxury required constant effort behind the scenes. Beneath this polished surface existed a parallel world, one largely unseen by guests, but essential to the functioning of these estates. Servants moved through hidden corridors and service tunnels, maintaining the seamless appearance of perfection. Their presence was both vital and invisible, a reminder that the grandeur of Newport relied upon a carefully controlled system of labor, while the elite displayed refinement above. An entire structure of discipline and hierarchy operated below. For those within the Vanderbilt circle, this environment created a complex tension between public image and private reality. Identity became increasingly tied to performance. Individuals were expected to embody the values of wealth, elegance, and composure, often at the expense of personal expression. Conversations, relationships, and even emotions were shaped by what was considered appropriate within this rarefied world. Marriages, in particular, reflected this tension. While some unions were formed with genuine affection, many were influenced by considerations of status, alliance, and social advantage. The expectations placed upon these relationships were immense. Couples were not only partners, but representatives of their family's standing. Any sign of discord risked undermining the carefully constructed image of stability and success. As a result, personal conflicts were often concealed, managed quietly behind closed doors. Despite their success in securing a place among the elite, a subtle uncertainty persisted. Acceptance had been granted, but it remained conditional, dependent on continued performance and adherence to unspoken rules. The Vanderbilts had entered a world that valued tradition as much as wealth, and while they had adapted remarkably, the need to prove themselves never fully disappeared. The Elms, completed in 1901, represented the culmination of this transformation. Its design, inspired by an 18th century French chateau, reflected not only wealth, but a deliberate alignment with European aristocratic ideals. Every room, every corridor, every carefully placed object contributed to a narrative of refinement and legitimacy. It was not enough to be wealthy. One had to appear timeless, cultured, and unquestionably established. Yet within this carefully curated world, something less tangible was gradually eroding. The constant emphasis on appearance left little space for authenticity. Individuals found themselves navigating roles defined by expectation rather than desire. The distinction between who they were and who they were expected to be became increasingly difficult to maintain. Publicly, the Vanderbilts had achieved everything they sought. They were admired, influential, and firmly embedded within the highest levels of society. Privately, however, the cost of this achievement was becoming more apparent. The pursuit of status had reshaped relationships, altered priorities, and introduced a quiet distance that could not easily be bridged. In Newport, the battle for status had been won, but in securing their place at the center of this world, the Vanderbilts had entered a system that demanded constant sacrifice. Acceptance, it seemed, was not an end but a condition that required continuous negotiation. And beneath the elegance of their surroundings, the question remained unresolved. Had they gained belonging, or simply mastered the art of appearing to belong? Asterisk. By 1901, the Elms stood complete in Newport, Rhode Island, a residence designed not merely for living, but for display. Commissioned by Edward Julius Berwind and his wife Hermine, the mansion embodied a vision of perfection shaped by European aristocratic influence. Inspired by the Château d'Yasny, in France, its architecture conveyed balance, symmetry, and control. Every detail, from its formal gardens to its grand interior halls, was carefully planned to project refinement without visible effort. Yet behind this appearance of ease lay a system of extraordinary precision. The house was designed to function as a self-contained world, supported by an intricate network of service corridors, hidden staircases, and basement workspaces. More than 40 servants operated within this structure, each assigned specific roles to ensure that the daily life of the household appeared seamless. Movements were timed, tasks coordinated, and interactions carefully managed to preserve the illusion that everything simply happened without intervention. The planning of events within the Elms reflected this same level of control. Social gatherings were not spontaneous occasions, but carefully orchestrated productions. Guest lists were assembled with attention to status and influence, ensuring that each invitation reinforced the household's position within elite society. Seating arrangements, menus, and even the sequence of conversations were considered in advance, guided by strict etiquette and unspoken expectations. For Hermine, the role of hostess carried both privilege and pressure. She was expected to embody elegance, composure, and hospitality at all times, presenting an image that aligned perfectly with the mansion's grandeur. Her presence at these events was not optional, it was essential to the success of the performance. Every gesture, every expression contributed to the overall impression of effortless refinement. The stakes of this environment extended beyond individual gatherings. Each event served as a reaffirmation of status, a demonstration that the Elms, those who resided within it, belonged among the highest ranks of society. Any deviation from expectation, however small, risked undermining this carefully constructed identity. As preparations unfolded behind the scenes, a quiet tension accompanied them. The system functioned flawlessly, yet it required constant attention, discipline, and restraint. Within these walls, nothing was left to chance, and in maintaining this level of perfection, something less visible but increasingly significant was being held in place, waiting for the moment when control alone would no longer be enough. Asterisk. Within the Elms, confrontation did not arrive as raised voices or public scandal. It unfolded quietly, shaped by expectation, restraint, and the constant tension between appearance and reality. The conflict was not external, but deeply internal, woven into the daily lives of those who inhabited the mansion. It was a struggle between who they were expected to be and who they might have been without the weight of expectation. For Hermine, this tension was most visible in her role as hostess. Each gathering required her to present an image of effortless grace, moving through rooms filled with influential guests while maintaining composure and charm. Conversations were measured, expressions controlled, and emotions carefully concealed. The success of each event depended not only on its organization, but on her ability to embody the ideals of refinement and stability. Yet beneath this polished exterior, the demands of such a role created a quiet strain. There was little space for spontaneity, and even less for vulnerability. Edworth, though less visibly engaged in the social performance, faced his own form of confrontation. His wealth had secured entry into this world, but maintaining that position required continuous affirmation. Business success alone was not enough. It had to be translated into social credibility. This placed him within a system where identity was closely tied to perception. His presence within elite society was both a sign of achievement and a reminder that acceptance was conditional. The true complexity of this confrontation lay in its invisibility. Two guests. The Elms represented perfectionate environment where everything functioned seamlessly, where elegance appeared natural and Yet this illusion depended on a constant suppression of anything that might disrupt it. Personal disagreements, moments of doubt, and emotional fatigue were kept out of sight, managed privately to preserve the integrity of the public image. Even the structure of the house reinforced this dynamic. The separation between the visible spaces of luxury and the hidden world of service mirrored the divide between appearance and reality. Servants moved silently through concealed corridors, ensuring that the visible world remained untouched by effort or imperfection. In doing so, they became witnesses to a reality that guests never saw, a world where the cost of maintaining perfection was both continuous and exacting. Over time, this environment shaped those within it. The need to perform became habitual, blurring the line between genuine behavior and learned response. Individuals adapted to their roles, internalizing expectations until they became indistinguishable from identity. The confrontation was no longer something to be resolved. It became a condition of existence within the Elms. In this setting, there was no single moment of conflict, no decisive break. Instead, there was a gradual realization that the pursuit of perfection required a quiet sacrifice. Authenticity, once set aside for the sake of acceptance, became increasingly difficult to reclaim, and within the carefully controlled world of the Elms, that loss would remain largely unseen yet deeply felt. Asterisk. The consequences of life within the Elms did not unfold in sudden collapse, but in gradual, almost imperceptible shifts that altered the inner lives of those who inhabited its grand spaces. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. The mansion continued to host gatherings, its rooms filled with light, conversation, and carefully maintained Yet, beneath this continuity, something quieter was taking place, slow erosion of authenticity that left its mark not on the structure itself, but on the people within it. For Hermione Berwind, the role she embodied so perfectly began to take on a different weight. What had once been a position of distinction gradually became a pattern that allowed little deviation. Her identity, so closely aligned with her duties as hostess, left limited space for personal expression. The expectations that surrounded her did not diminish over time. If anything, they became more deeply ingrained. Each successful event reinforced the necessity of maintaining the same level of control, the same composed presence. Over time, the distinction between performance and self grew increasingly difficult to define. Edward Berwind experienced a parallel transformation, though expressed in quieter ways. His position within elite society required not only wealth, but consistency on ongoing demonstration that he belonged within this rarefied circle. The pressure to sustain this perception extended beyond public appearances, influencing decisions, behaviors, and even the rhythms of daily life. Success, once measured by achievement, became tied to maintenance, the ability to preserve an image that could not afford visible weakness. Within the household, the structure that ensured perfection also contributed to a sense of separation. The division between the visible and the hidden, between those who served and those who served, created an environment where interactions were defined by roles rather than relationships. Servants, though essential to the functioning of the mansion, remained largely unseen, their presence acknowledged only through the seamless execution of their duties. This distance reinforced a broader pattern within the house, one in which genuine connection was often replaced by formality. Over time, this environment influenced the nature of relationships within the Elms. Conversations were shaped by etiquette, interactions guided by expectation. Moments that might have allowed for openness were often redirected into safer, more controlled exchanges. The need to uphold appearances extended into private life, where personal conflicts were managed discreetly. If acknowledged at all, silence became a tool for preserving stability, even when it concealed underlying strain. The broader social context of the Gilded Age amplified these effects. Within elite circles, reputation was both fragile and essential. A single misstep could alter perception, making caution a constant presence and discipline. For those within the Elms, this awareness contributed to a heightened sense of vigilance. Actions were considered not only for their immediate impact, but for how they might be interpreted within a wider social framework. This continuous evaluation shaped behavior in subtle but lasting ways. As the years passed, the mansion itself remained unchanged, its architecture a testament to permanence and control. Yet the world beyond its walls began to shift. The early 20th century brought changes in economic conditions, social structures, and cultural values. The rigid hierarchies that had defined the Gilded Age began to soften, and the unquestioned dominance of families like the Vanderbilts and their contemporaries faced new challenges. These external changes introduced a contrast between the stability of the Elms and the evolving realities outside it. Within this context, the lifestyle maintained within the mansion began to reveal its limitations. The systems that had once ensured perfection proved less adaptable to change. The emphasis on preservation of image, of status, of tradition made adjustment difficult. What had been a strength became, gradually, a constraint. The emotional consequences of this environment were not dramatic, but cumulative. A sense of distance, of roles carefully maintained, persisted beneath the surface of daily life. The pursuit of perfection had achieved its goal. The Elms stood as a symbol of refinement and success, yet in securing that image, something less visible had been set aside. In the end, the aftermath of life within the Elms was not defined by failure, but by a quiet realization. The structures of control, the discipline of performance, and the demands of status had created a world that functioned flawlessly. But within that world, the space for something more genuine had gradually diminished. What remained was a legacy of elegance, complete, impressive, and undeniably powerful, yet marked by an absence that could not easily be restored. There was no single evening when everything changed within the Elms, no dramatic revelation, no moment that could be clearly identified as the beginning of decline. Instead, the point of no return emerged quietly, almost unnoticed, as the patterns of life within the mansion solidified into something permanent. What had once been a series of choices gradually became a fixed reality. For those who lived within its walls, the realization came not through conflict, but through repetition. The same routines, the same expectations, the same carefully controlled interactions continued day after day, year after year. Over time, the possibility of living differently began to feel distant, even unrealistic. The roles that had once been assumed for the sake of acceptance became inseparable from identity. There was no clear boundary between performance and self-only. A continuous merging of the two. Ermini Barwind, in particular, stood at the center of this transformation. Her presence defined the atmosphere of the Elms, her composure essential to its image, yet the constancy of that role left little room for change. Any deviation, however small, risked unsettling the delicate balance that had been so carefully maintained. The expectations placed upon her were no longer external pressures, they had been internalized, shaping her behavior even in moments of solitude. For Edward Berwind, the point of no return lay in the recognition that success had created its own confinement. The wealth that had granted entry into elite society now required continuous validation. To step away, to alter course, would not simply be a personal decision, it would challenge the very identity that had been constructed. Over decades. The cost of change had become too great, not in material terms, but in the risk of losing everything that defined their place in the world. Beyond the individuals themselves, the mansion reinforced this permanence. Its architecture, its routines, and its social function all operated within a framework that resisted disruption. The Elms was not designed for transformation. It was designed for continuity. To exist within it was to participate in a system that valued stability above all. Elstad in this way, the point of no return was not marked by loss, but by acceptance. The understanding that the life they had built so carefully structured, so outwardly perfect, could not be undone without consequence. The possibility of authenticity, once within reach, had been quietly exchanged for permanence, and within that exchange, something essential had been left behind, beyond recovery. As the early decades of the 20th century unfolded, the world surrounding the Elms began to change in ways that could not be controlled through wealth or careful planning. The Gilded Age, with its rigid hierarchies and unquestioned displays of luxury, gradually gave way to a more uncertain and shifting social landscape. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 marked a turning point, altering not only global politics but also the structure of societies that had once seemed immovable. For families who had built their identities around stability and status, this transition introduced a quiet but persistent tension. The values that had defined their world tradition, exclusivity, and visible wealth no longer carried the same unquestioned authority. Public perception began to shift, and with it, the meaning of influence. The grandeur that had once symbolized success was increasingly viewed through a different lens, one that questioned excess rather than admired it. Within the Elms, these changes were not immediately visible, but they were deeply felt. The routines of the household continued, the structure remained intact, and the appearance of refinement persisted. Yet beneath this continuity, there was a growing awareness that the world beyond its walls no longer aligned with the one it had been built to reflect. The certainty that had once defined life within the mansion began to give way to a quieter form of uncertainty. For individuals like Edward and Hermione, this period became one of internal reflection rather than external conflict. The battles they faced were not against rivals or social exclusion, but against the gradual realization that the systems they had upheld were losing their relevance. The question was no longer how to maintain position, but what that position truly meant in a changing world. These reflections did not lead to sudden transformation. Instead, they unfolded slowly, shaped by habit and circumstance. The desire to preserve what had been built remained strong, even as its significance began to shift. Adaptation, though possible, required a departure from long-held patterns, something that proved difficult within a structure designed for continuity and Tyson. The final battles of the Elms were quiet and internal. They were defined not by visible struggle, but by a gradual reassessment of identity, purpose, and legacy. The mansion remained a symbol of control and permanence, yet the world it represented was no longer certain, and within that uncertainty, the question of what would endure and what would fade became impossible to ignore. As time moved forward, the Elms remained unchanged in structure, unwavering in its presence while the world around it continued to evolve. What had once been a private residence designed to reflect the ideals of wealth and refinement gradually took on a different role. It became a symbol not only of an era, but of a way of life that was both admired and questioned. The architecture of the Elms itself played a central role in this transformation. Its design, inspired by 18th century French aristocratic estates, was intended to evoke permanence and cultural legitimacy. The symmetry of its facade, the precision of its gardens, and the carefully curated interiors all conveyed a sense of order that extended beyond aesthetics. It represented control over space, over experience, and, by extension, over perception. Visitors who passed through its halls encountered not simply a building, but a narrative of success that had been meticulously constructed. Yet as the decades progressed, the meaning of that narrative began to shift. The same features that once symbolized achievement started to reflect something more complex. The scale of the mansion, once celebrated as a triumph of wealth, became a reminder of excess in a world increasingly aware of inequality. The hidden corridors, designed to maintain the illusion of effortless living, revealed the extent to which that illusion depended on unseen labor. What had once been admired without question began to invite closer examination. By the mid-20th century, the Elms transitioned from a private residence into a preserved, historical landmark under the care of the Preservation Society of Newport County. This change marked a significant turning point in its legacy. No longer inhabited as a living household, the mansion became a space for observation, a place where visitors could engage with the past from a distance. The rooms that had once hosted carefully orchestrated gatherings were now arranged for public viewing, their contents preserved as representations of a particular moment in history. This transformation introduced a new layer of meaning. As a museum, the Elms offered a curated version of the past, highlighting its elegance, while leaving its complexities open to interpretation. Visitors could admire the craftsmanship, the artistry, and the attention to detail. Yet the emotional realities that had shaped life within its walls remained largely unseen. The experience was one of observation rather than participation, allowing the grandeur to be appreciated without fully confronting the conditions that had sustained it. In this way, the Elms became both a monument and a mirror. It stood as a testament to the ambitions of those who built it, reflecting their desire for permanence and recognition. At the same time, it revealed the limitations of that ambition. The very features that had been designed to secure status could not prevent the passage of time or the shifting of values. The mansion endured, but the world that had given it meaning did not remain unchanged. The symbolism of the elms extended beyond its physical presence. It came to represent a broader narrative about wealth, identity, and the nature of legacy. The Vanderbilts and their contemporaries had succeeded in creating structures that would outlast them, ensuring that their names remained associated with influence and refinement. Yet these structures also carried the imprint of the choices that had defined their creation, the emphasis on appearance, the reliance on control, and the quiet sacrifices made in the pursuit of belonging. Public memory shaped through preservation and storytelling often focuses on the visible aspects of such legacies. The grandeur of the elms is readily apparent, its beauty accessible to anyone who walks through its doors. But alongside this public narrative exists a more private truth, one that cannot be fully captured through architecture alone. It is found in the experiences of those who lived within its walls, the expectations they navigated, the roles they fulfilled, and the realities they concealed. As a symbol, the elms does not offer a single, fixed meaning. Instead, it invites reflection. It stands as evidence of what can be achieved through wealth and ambition, while also suggesting the complexity of what is required to sustain such achievement. Its endurance ensures that the story it represents continues to be told, even as its interpretation evolves with each generation. In the end, the elms remains both complete and incomplete a structure that preserves the image of an era while leaving its deeper truths open to discovery. It endures not only as a monument to what was built, but as a reminder of what cannot be fully preserved. The lived experiences, the quiet tensions, and the unseen costs that shaped its existence. Asterisk. The decline of the world that created the elms did not arrive as a single, dramatic collapse, but as a gradual unwinding shaped by forces far beyond the control of any one family. By the early 20th century, the conditions that had allowed immense fortunes to flourish so visibly were beginning to shift. Economic changes, new taxation policies, and evolving social attitudes steadily altered the landscape that had once favored concentrated wealth and rigid hierarchy. The First World War marked a decisive turning point. Its impact extended beyond the battlefield, reshaping economies and redefining the role of wealth within society. The overt displays of luxury that had characterized the Gilded Age became increasingly difficult to justify in a world marked by loss and uncertainty. Public perception began to shift, and with it, the cultural value of grandeur. What had once symbolized success now carried undertones of excess. For estates like the elms, this change presented a practical challenge. The cost of maintaining such a property was immense. The system that had once supported its operation, large numbers of domestic staff, extensive resources, and a stable social structure became increasingly difficult to sustain. Labor dynamics changed, and fewer individuals were willing or able to work within the strict hierarchies that had defined household service during the Gilded Age. The seamless functioning of the mansion, once taken for granted, required adjustments that altered its very nature. At the same time, the distribution of wealth within families, like the Vanderbilts, contributed to a gradual dilution of their influence. Fortunes that had once been concentrated in the hands of a single individual were divided across generations, reducing their overall impact. Without the same level of unified control, maintaining dominance both economically and socially became more complex. The cohesion that had defined the earlier rise of the dynasty began to weaken. Cultural shifts further accelerated this process. The rigid social codes that had governed elite society lost much of their authority as new ideas about identity, opportunity, and merit began to take hold. The distinction between old money and new money once a defining feature of social interaction, became less significant in a society that increasingly valued innovation over inheritance. The structures that had once excluded and then reluctantly accepted families like the Vanderbilts no longer held the same power. Within this changing environment, the Elms stood as a reminder of a world that was fading. Its architecture remained unchanged, its presence still commanding, yet its function had altered. No longer central to an active social hierarchy, it became part of a historical narrative rather than a living system of influence. The transition from private residence to preserved landmark reflected this broader shift from participation to remembrance. The final outcome was not the disappearance of the Vanderbilt legacy, but its transformation. The name endured, associated with a period of extraordinary growth and ambition. The estates remained, preserved as symbols of what had been achieved, yet the direct power that once accompanied that legacy had diminished. Influence, once exercised through control of industries and social circles, became more diffuse, less visible, and less central to the structure of society. In this sense, the decline was both material and symbolic. The systems that had supported the rise of the Elms could not be sustained indefinitely, and the values that had defined its purpose evolved beyond recognition. What remained was a legacy preserved in stone, a reflection of a moment in history when wealth and ambition shaped not only fortunes, but identities. The Elms did not fall into ruin. It endured, but in enduring, it revealed a quiet truth. Power, no matter how vast, is rarely permanent. It changes form, loses its immediacy, and eventually becomes part of the past it once defined. Asterisk, beyond the visible decline of wealth and influence, there existed a quieter cost, one that could not be measured in currency or preserved in architecture. It was a cost carried within individuals, passed through generations, and rarely spoken of in the same way as financial legacy. While the grandeur of estates like the Elms endured, the emotional realities that accompanied their creation and maintenance remained largely unexamined. For those born into this world, identity was rarely a matter of personal choice. From an early age, expectations were defined by a family name, social position, and the unspoken responsibility to uphold a legacy that had been built long before they were born. This inheritance, while outwardly advantageous, often limited the ability to define oneself independently. Decisions, whether personal, professional, or relational, were shaped by considerations that extended beyond individual desire. The pressure to maintain continuity created a subtle but persistent tension. Success was not simply encouraged, it was expected. Deviation from established norms risked not only personal consequence, but a perceived disruption of the family's standing. As a result, many found themselves navigating a narrow path, balancing personal inclination with collective expectation. Over time, this balancing act could lead to a quiet sense of disconnection between who one was and who one was expected to be. Relationships within such an environment were similarly influenced. While bonds of family and partnership remained central, they were often shaped by the same forces that governed public life. Marriages, friendships, and alliances could carry implicit expectations related to status, compatibility, and social perception. Emotional expression, though present, was frequently moderated by the need to preserve stability and image. This dynamic did not eliminate connection, but it often altered its nature, making it more structured and, at times, more restrained. Across generations, these patterns accumulated. Each new member of the family inherited not only wealth, but a framework of behavior and expectation. The original pursuit of success, driven by ambition and necessity, evolved into a system that prioritized preservation over transformation. While this ensured continuity, it also limited adaptability, making it more difficult to respond to changing circumstances or to redefine identity in individual terms. In public memory, the legacy of families like the Vanderbilts is often associated with achievement, industrial success, architectural grandeur, and social influence. These elements are visible, tangible, and easily understood. The emotional cost, by contrast, is less apparent. It exists in the quiet adjustments made over time, in the compromises that become habitual, and in the distance that can form between external image and internal experience. This cost does not diminish the significance of what was built, nor do it negate the accomplishments of those who achieved it. Instead, it adds a layer of complexity to the narrative. It reminds us that behind systems of power and symbols of success are individuals navigating pressures that are not always visible from the outside. The Elms, in its preserved form, offers a glimpse into a world defined by precision, control, and ambition. Yet within that world, there were experiences that cannot be fully captured by its walls. The cost no one talks about is not found in what was lost materially, but in what was quietly set aside: moments of authenticity, freedom of choice, and the ability to exist beyond expectation. The story of the Elms and the Vanderbilt era is not simply one of wealth, power, and architectural brilliance. It is a story of transformation shaped by ambition and sustained by expectation. From modest beginnings on the waters of New York to the marble halls of Newport, power was built through relentless determination, strategic control, and an unyielding desire to rise above limitation. What began as a pursuit of opportunity evolved into a system of influence that reshaped industries, society, and identity itself. Yet what was gained came with a cost that could not be displayed as easily as wealth. The same discipline that built empires also created distance between individuals, within families, and between identity and image. Acceptance into elite society, once the ultimate goal, required continuous performance, leaving little space for authenticity. The structures that ensured success also limited freedom, shaping lives around expectation rather than choice. The Elms stands today as a testament to what was achieved. Its grandeur remains undeniable, its presence a reflection of an era defined by excess and aspiration. But within its walls lies a quieter truth. The perfection it represents was not without sacrifice. Behind the elegance were lives shaped by pressure, roles maintained at the expense of individuality, and a constant effort to preserve an image that could never fully capture reality. In the end, the Vanderbilts and their world secured a form of immortality through legacy. Their names endure, their estates preserved, their influence remembered. But what was lost along the way? Authentic connection, personal freedom, and the ability to exist beyond expectation could not be carried forward in the same way, because history's greatest victories often leave behind something unseen. And, in the case of the Elms, what remains is not only a monument to success, but a reminder that power and peace are rarely one together.